Judith,
Yeah.
you're a climatologist, former chair of School of Earth and Atmospheric Science in Georgia. Your research interests include hurricanes, atmospheric modeling, polar climates, air-sea selections.
Yeah.
You're a co-author of different books on climate and a co-author of over 190 scientific papers. And even though you belong to the so-called 97% of scientists who agree on the global warming stuff, you say the IPCC reports typically neglects what you call the uncertainty monster, right?
Yes.
What do you mean by the uncertainty monster?
Well, the uncertainty monster is a metaphor for conflicts between facts and values, the unknown, scientists tending to be overconfident in what they think they know without considering the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So there's a lot of scope for people to be wrong, possibly be wrong, particularly about their future projections of what the climate might look like.
But why are these uncertainties not being debated?
Well, the pressure really comes from the policymakers. I mean, back, in the late 1980s and around 1990, when the IPCC and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, when these were just being formulated, they just wanted to focus on man-made climate change and was it dangerous? So the scientists focused very narrowly on man-made climate change to the neglect of the other processes. And as a result, they became too reliant on climate models, which basically don't accurately simulate a lot of the natural processes. And certainly for projections, they completely ignore things like future solar variability and future volcanic eruptions and the large-scale ocean circulations, which decadal to millennial scale variations in these ocean cycles. And so what we've come up with this very narrow framing of the climate problem, which ignores what may be the most important factors, actually.
But is there scientific proof of how much man-made CO2 is contributing to our changing climate?
There's no way to prove that. I mean, this is one of the biggest challenges. I mean, the IPCC conclusion actually says more than half. Okay, that's a lot of space between 51% versus 100%. Some people that think it is closer to half or maybe even less than half. There's no unambiguous way to infer this. And the way we infer this is through climate models, and the climate models are very imperfect. And they've been tuned to the present climate, and there's all sorts of uncertainties and tunings that make their application for that purpose to be very ambiguous. So we don't know.
Mainstream news outlets, universities, politicians, all are claiming the start of an apocalypse. How serious can we take these statements?
We don't know what the future holds. It's very unlikely that it would be triggered solely by CO2 emissions. There may be something that happens to the West Antarctic ice sheet associated with volcanoes underneath the ice sheet that would cause it to destabilize. Something like that could happen, but just the warming from CO2 emissions. First off, the scenario, the so-called business as usual scenario for CO2 emissions is virtually impossible based on easily accessible. They're based on flawed projections. They assume no technology development of population growth. They assume a return to coal scenario, all sorts of unrealistic things. So that worst scenario, you should just throw it out the window, the so-called RCP 8.5. And then if you look at the more reasonable emissions scenarios, most of the climate models seem to be running too hot when you compare them with observations. So if you look at the more reasonable emissions scenarios and the more reasonable climate model simulations, I mean, just from CO2 emissions alone, we wouldn't expect to exceed 2 degrees in the 21st century. And there's also all sorts of natural climate variability. It looks like we're heading to a relative solar minimum sometime in the 21st century. Possibility of volcanic eruptions similar to what we saw in the early 19th century. We're looking at the transition to the cold phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation sometime in the next 2 decades. So there's lots of other things that could happen that would even counteract a relatively modest amount of warming. We just don't know. But the apocalyptic predictions depend on unrealistic emission scenarios and unrealistic climate model simulations. So if you throw those two out, you're left with, a relatively modest amount of warming that may be counteracted by natural variability.
So the whole climate research, you say, does not pay enough attention on natural climate variability? Is this due to the lack of funding on natural variability?
Well, the issue is this: it's a complex, climate is a complex, chaotic system. You've got two chaotic fluids, the ocean and the atmosphere, coupled together. One person even called the situation pandemonium. It's very difficult to predict. It's very difficult to decipher. And the external forcing, like CO2 or solar variability, projects onto these modes of chaotic variability. And trying to sort all that out is very challenging. I would say there is not enough funding that goes into understanding the natural variability. In the fifth assessment report for the IPCC in 2013, I don't feel it was sufficiently well integrated into the overall conclusions. Hopefully, the sixth assessment report that's forthcoming in a few years will do a better job. I don't know. But to me, this is the real frontier of climate research, is really understanding these modes of natural climate variability and how the external forcing projects onto them. And it's particularly important for the high latitude ice sheets, Greenland, Antarctic, the Arctic sea ice, things like that.
One of your expertise is polar climates, right? We see articles in our media how fast the polar ice seems to be disappearing due to human influence, which, according to news outlets, will lead to dramatic acceleration of sea level rise. How serious can we take these statements, and what is the actual data is telling us?
Well, over the period, particularly 2007 to maybe 2012 or so, we saw some rapid melting of the Arctic sea ice and also the Greenland ice cap. But a lot of this is natural variability. We saw a similar big melting in the 1930s. And this is associated, again, with these large-scale ocean circulations, in particular the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. Okay, right now we're in a similar phase, a warm phase of this oscillation, like we were in the 1930s. So part of what we're seeing, is natural variability. And if you read deep down in the chapters of the IPCC report, they acknowledge this, that it's very difficult to separate out what's human-caused versus natural variability in the Arctic. So, it's not like I'm saying anything that goes against what most scientists understand, but when you look at the hype that is made in the media, and which is also amplified by certain scientists who don't really study or understand all this, then you get something that's very misleading. And, at some time in maybe a decade or two, we can expect to flip to the cold phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and then I would expect things to very much slow down. Again, we'll have to see if that plays out, but I anticipate that it will. So there's a lot of overwrought hysteria, blaming everything that you see in the climate and in the weather on CO2 emissions. And that's, incorrect, and it's very misleading for policy. It's as if we stop burning fossil fuels, somehow our climate and weather is going to get a lot better relatively quickly. Well, that's not going to happen.
What is the most urgent scientific focus for you regarding climate change?
The West Antarctic ice sheet.
Oh, wow.
No question. And if that were to collapse, and it's something that in principle could happen on the time scale of the 21st century, that would add, more than a meter of sea level rise.
Oh, wow.
And if that were to collapse, right now it's not really being influenced by CO2 directly. It's influenced by the ocean circulations and also the heat flux from below from these under ice volcanoes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's unstable. It's a dynamic. The ice doesn't melt; it actually flows and then flows into the ocean and then melts. So, to me, that this is the most dynamic part of the climate system. The thing that could have, maybe a catastrophic impact if we were to realize over a meter of sea level rise from that in the 21st century. So to me, that's the thing to watch.
Again, in terms of the West Antarctic ice sheet, are human emissions contributing to it directly?
Well, I mean, there's probably some contribution, but it's really the oceans and the geology that are the bigger players rather than the atmosphere. So,
because of your views on the scientific consensus, you have been called a heretic, denier, etc., all in an attempt to run you down as a scientist, even by your own colleagues. I mean, why this whole thing has become so political?
It had to do with my criticism of the behavior of scientists, particularly those whose behavior was revealed in the ClimateGate emails, and also criticisms about the IPCC consensus-seeking process. Okay, it's verboten, forbidden to criticize the institutions or your colleagues, and that's what really provoked the ire, not so much my scientific positions or my publications or anything like that. The uncertainty thing was a bit marginal. They don't really like to hear about uncertainty, but what really got to them was my criticism of the behavior of scientists. I saw them lacking in transparency. I saw them trying to sabotage people who disagreed with them. So that's what I really object to, and I spoke up and called them on it, and that was what the unforgivable behavior was on my part. Oh, sorry, this isn't a club. We need to be as transparent and honest as we can, and disagreement should be allowed to flourish as people pursue different avenues and draw different conclusions. And what we have instead is consensus enforcement. Prior to 2009, I felt that supporting the IPCC consensus on climate change was a responsible thing to do. I bought into the argument, don't trust what one scientist says, trust what an international team of 1,000 scientists has said after years of careful deliberation. That all changed for me in November 2009 following the leaked ClimateGate emails that illustrated the sausage making and even bullying that went into building the consensus. I started speaking out, saying that scientists needed to do better at making the data and supporting information publicly available, being more transparent about how they reach conclusions, doing a better job of assessing uncertainties, and actively engaging with scientists having minority perspectives. The response of my colleagues to this is summed up by the title of a 2010 article in the Scientific American. Climate heretic Judith Curry turns on her colleagues. I have been called a denier by other climate scientists, and most recently by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. My motives have been questioned by Representative Grijalva in a recent letter sent to the president of Georgia Tech. I came to the growing realization that I had fallen into the trap of groupthink. I had accepted the consensus based on second-order evidence, the assertion that a consensus existed.
How did you deal with it?
Well, the way I personally dealt with it is I resigned my tenured faculty position, and I am no longer in academia or working for a university. I have my own company, Climate Forecast Applications Network. It does research and applications, help governments and companies help understand and deal with weather and climate related threats. And I find this a much more honest situation in terms of working on things that really matter with people who really want an answer as to what kind of risks they might be facing, and not just wanting to support a political agenda, to reduce fossil fuels or whatever.
So you have become independent now.
I don't seek government funding. I do my research. I have clients who fund it. And I also, just my own time, which isn't necessarily paid for. So I don't get government grants for my research. That allows me to just research whatever I want.
If science doesn't embrace uncertainty anymore and it's consensus locked, what does science mean by then?
Okay, there's a lot of people who are promoting their own careers. They want seats at the important policy tables. They get big international awards for their climate activism, sometimes with $1 million prizes. So there's a lot of, they receive the awards from the professional society. So it's a very good career move for these people. So it's careerism. They've abandoned science in favor of careerism. So, and they've been encouraged by funding agencies, by universities, by the media, by the professional societies, and so forth and so on. So it's a very bad situation. Not a good situation at all for science.